Back, everybody. So if we could begin to find our seats. And I'm really glad to see so much conversation and aliveness. Oh, it's great. And let's just settle back in. And Judy will be speaking. And to welcome Judy, we have David once again in his form of subtle being.
It's my honor and privilege to introduce Judy McAllister to you. I met Judy a great number of years ago, and when I met her, she had just become the first female focalizer for the Findhorn community. She had stepped into an all-male management group, and she was just finding her way, feeling her way into how best to fulfill the role in which she now found herself. But Judy had come up through a number of the departments in the community. She's been part of Findhorn now for 40 years. So she's very much experienced and anchored in the life and spirit of Findhorn. Over these years, she's served in many of the departments, but mostly she has worked with Dorothy Maclean. She helped Dorothy edit and develop a number of her books, but even more importantly, she has traveled with Dorothy for 20 years as Dorothy toured the world giving talks on communication with nature. Judy has stepped into Dorothy's shoes in many ways, and she also now travels internationally, both as a representative of the game of transformation and to speak on behalf of the voices of nature. She is also the co-author of a book, Earth Fever, Living Consciously with Climate Change. I know you're going to have a wonderful session with Judy. I wish I could be there with you. She is filled with wisdom and insight, and she brings lifelong experience of listening to the voices of nature. I wish you all a wonderful passport session, and I know she will be a delight.
The things we have to try to live up to. I'm trying to find my feet after integrating all the things that Marco had to say. Kind of like, well, how to segue in. I was amused when, at the beginning of the week, when David was talking about, as Mary so eloquently said. And I feel like I could stand here and go, as Jeremy so eloquently said, as Soren so eloquently said, as Marco so eloquently said. Someday I'm going to get to be one of the first speakers at a conference. Yeah, this has started to become an ambition. You know, so that my best quotes and the things that I really want to say somehow are still there for me to say when I get to stand up here. But, you know, life is what life is. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, John, as part of his announcements, kind of, asked us to channel our sardineness. And last night, in the middle of the night, I woke up and I didn't know what shape I needed to change into in order to make enough room in my bedroom for, this 1,000-year-old araucaria tree that showed up, and a 600-year-old fig tree that showed up, and some other aspects of the forest that showed up in my bedroom because they all wanted their voices represented here. So in some ways, I feel like I need to go full circle, go back to the early days of this particular community, and to really honor and acknowledge, in particular, Dorothy Maclean. It was her work with what she referred to as the DEVAS that really helped to build the garden, and that made this place and this experiment a little bit different than what was going on in some other intentional spiritual communities or other experiments that were all birthed out of that movement that hit the planet in the 60s. I don't think it's any accident, as it were, that a number of the big movements and the big communities that are still influencing our world today happened in the few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. I've been told that in that period of time, when we were as a collective facing the possibility of nuclear war, the Russians and the Americans were saber rattling, as they say, that there was a cry that went out from the soul of humanity. There was a cry that went out into the cosmos, and that cry was responded to by any number of beings, and that cry also precipitated, emerging out of Gaia itself, what we would now probably call the flower power movement. It came through music. It came through books like Rachel Carson's Silent Springs. It came through the creation of communities like Findhorn and Esalen and Oroville. There was an impulse toward bringing into manifestation a different way of seeing life, a different way of living life. And it was, in some circles, very popular to call it a new age. But the new age wasn't something way out in the future. New age was something that lived in us, and something that we could bring into manifestation by the ways that we engaged with all of the intelligences. So let me define Deva. Soren did some of this the other day. Deva is a Sanskrit word, and it means being of light or shining one. And when Dorothy first began to engage with the Devas, with the intelligence that informs the forms that we see on a physical level, she experienced them as formless energy fields. She didn't see anything, she didn't hear anything. She experienced an energetic field that she could engage with and encounter when she stood in her sacred self. For her, that was really important. We would call it the standing, we would call it self-light, we would call it all sorts of things today. She called it God. And she often simplified the whole process by saying, it's like one aspect of God talking to another aspect of God. The God in me, the God in her, speaking to that which is divine, that which is sacred, in any given form we can perceive with our eyes, or taste, or touch. She didn't want to call them angels, because angels are full of form. They have wings and halos and harps and all that kind of stuff. And we hear the word angel and we immediately go to certain associations. She wanted to have something that was more neutral. So she, in her Sufi studies, had come across this word Deva, so she decided to use that word, which worked really well through all of the workshops we did over the years and all the workshops she did over the years, until we went to Thailand, where Deva is a word as full of images and preconceptions as angel might be here. So it was interesting to come up against that way back then. Devas hold the energetic seed idea of whatever form they are overlighting. So every species of plant, every animal has its own devic overlighting presence. If we wanted to do a metaphor, we could say, you know, the devas are the architect. They hold the idea for what eventually, through the work of multiple layers of reality and subtle beings, becomes a form that we can perceive in our consensus reality. But they hold the energetic patterning, the seed idea for what will eventually be made manifest. They are planetary beings. When we talk about devas, we're not talking about the spirit that might inhabit a particular plant or a particular tree. The devas hold the pattern for, so for instance, Dorothy met the deva of the garden pea, was her first contact. Again, the message of love comes forward. She chose something when she was first encouraged to connect with the intelligence of nature. Her initial response was, don't be ridiculous, vegetables don't have a brain, how can they have intelligence? But the prompting to connect with the intelligence had come from her inner sacred source, her inner divinity. And she'd spent 10 years learning to trust that inner divinity. So she sought a way to engage with that intelligence. And so she looked to what she loved, the garden pea, her favorite vegetable. And she did indeed find a way to connect. Long story short, we can all do that. This is one of those capacities, capabilities that Jeremy and Soren were talking about. They are part of our inheritance that comes from the lineage of who we sourced from as a creature, as a species. We all have this capacity. We may or may not access it. It may or may not be our own particular personal preference. Maybe it comes through animals. Maybe it comes through, but focus on what you love. For me, it was trees. Definitely, it was trees. As a child, I was one of those kids that was more often up in a tree than anywhere else. I loved to climb. The forest was where I went. I grew up in northeastern Ontario, so the mixed hardwood forests of the Laurentian Shield were the tapestry that I looked at on a daily basis through most of my early childhood and into my teens. And I didn't really understand the wonder of that or how glorious that really was until I started to travel in my 20s. And to this day, there's still very few things that touch my heart quite the way the sight of the forests in the autumn, in the colors, can bring me into a state of quite profound joy. So it was through Dorothy's engagement with the devas, and then Rock brought in all of the nature spirits, and then David Spangler arrived in a whole other level of engagement with the subtle worlds and aspects of the subtle worlds is part of Findhorn's history. So in hosting this conference, this gathering, for me it's been a gathering. We've almost gone full circle, and my hope is that we as a community, certainly with your help, we as a species can take some kind of quantum leap and move into what's the next stage of this collaboration, cooperation with all of these intelligences. How do we open ourselves in a way that allows us to discover where's our particular point of contact? What is it that opens our hearts and our sensitivities to these other worlds? And it's not going to look the way it looks necessarily for Jeremy or for Soren or for me or for Marco or for Dorothy. It'll look your way. And this is the thing that in my connections with the devas so far, this is one of the messages that keeps coming out over and over and over again. They are waiting for us to make the connection. They are waiting for us to open portals and doorways and ways of engaging in communion and communication. We're the ones that need to do that, and then they can meet us. One of my challenges the last 10 years or so has been, how do I say this? We often use language that says we're listening to the land or we're speaking for nature. We don't need to do that. Nature can speak for itself. We need to learn to listen. This is my, I can get quite passionate about this. You know, if you can, please indulge me and preface most of my sentences with, in my experience or in my opinion. Yeah, because I know I can get quite sometimes. And it's not that this is the truth, but it's my truth right now. And my way of engaging with and trying to communicate about this stuff. So I'm going to skip forward a whole bunch because I want to give the last half hour of my time with all of you to their voices, not mine. I think it was about 2007, 2008. Dorothy received an invitation to come to Brazil to launch her book, The Call of the Trees, in its Portuguese edition. At that point, Dorothy was 86 years old. She was still traveling, she was still teaching, she was still saying yes to this lifelong path of teaching. What's funny is that Dorothy and I are both by inclination introverts. We are both by inclination probably happier as hermits. So, you know, there's a certain irony in the fact that we end up living in community and we end up doing things like this. It's part of the things she and I have been able to joke about and commiserate with each other about over the years. Anyway, we were flying from Miami in Florida to Manaus, which is in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. And at a certain point, you know, I'm sitting in my chair, happily reading my book, some not so illuminating detective novel. And I suddenly was overwhelmed with this sense of joy. And I thought, what? What's that? What's this about? And I went inside to try and figure out what was going on. And I was simply prompted to look outside. So Dorothy was sitting next to the window, and I asked her to lift the blind, and we looked out the window. And below us, there was this sea of green. This absolute, as far as the eyes could see, and at 30,000 feet, that's quite a long way. It was just green. And rising up out of this field of green was this palpable sense of joy. It was visceral. It was just like every cell in my body began to ring with this quality of joy. And it was very, very overwhelming. And I realized that's the forest. That's what happens when a system that's still intact is allowed to sing its song. It's allowed to sing the harmonies and the vocalizations and the rhythms and patterns, the music of the forest. And I experienced it as music. I didn't hear anything, but I experienced it as music. Fast forward a whole bunch more. We didn't get to spend a lot of time with trees or with the forests because, you know, there was this long schedule of talks and workshops and seminars and book signings and all the rest of it. It would be several years before I again had an opportunity to be with forest in that country. And this time it was with the Atlantic rainforest that skirts the coast of the entire continent. And there's only about 7% of this forest left. Most of it has been cut and the land converted to farmland and cattle and all the rest of it. But I was privileged to be able to go to a very small parcel of the Atlantic rainforest that was still intact. And we had a couple of days there, and on the first morning we went for a walk. The host, my host and hostess, were going to take us for a walk. Dorothy was no longer with us by that time. You know, she'd moved back to Findhorn, and she was happily ensconced here. And this was something I'd been looking forward to for a very long time. I wanted to meet the forest because I'd had an experience much earlier of touching into something that in the end I called the voice of the forest, because it wasn't the deva of one particular tree. It was a sum total experience of the forest as a wholeness. And I had been trying to find places where I could touch that again. So I was hopeful that I could. So we went for a walk, and again, that sense of just, you know, what was it you said, something about we'll die of beauty? It was a bit like that. Everything in my body began to resonate with what I was hearing beyond the sounds of the forest, beyond what my eyes could perceive. And what my eyes could perceive was quite amazing, because, you know, there were all these plants that little cosseted house plants, little bromeliads and ferns and orchids, and they were just like everywhere. And huge. And vines all over the place, and you couldn't really tell where one thing ended and another thing began. It was exquisite. And I alternated between great bouts of tears and riotous laughter. There was nothing I could do about it. You know, I'm sure the people that were with me thought I was just a little bit, you know, but there was nothing else I could do. That the power of the song that I was hearing and the quality of the energy that I was experiencing, it took me 3 days to find the word that could name what I was experiencing. And the word finally was exaltation. I knew myself to be walking in and participating in a living prayer. A prayer about life. A prayer about Gaia. A prayer of welcoming us as human beings into the web. Somewhere along the line, in that first time that I was there for 3 days, in one of my morning meditations by this exquisite little waterfall, you know, straight out of a Hollywood movie set, you know, all these trees and dripping vines and all the rest of it, and this little pond and the waterfall and the sound of the waterfall. I mean, you know, Hollywood could not have created a better set. It was just perfect. And I would go down there every morning to meditate. And at a certain point, I was asked if I would, let me see. They say it better than I do. There are love letters we would have you write on our behalf. Too deep are the wounds of the heart. Too broad are the scars across the land. For anything but love to be the force that heals us all. Love to reweave the web of life. Love to thread new strands. Love to build a new future. So, toward the end of the morning, I'd like to share a couple of those letters. It feels like it's part of my deal with them. One of the things that they keep repeating over and over and over again is asking us to remember what we really are. to step into the fullness of what we really are, to step into the creatorship that the co-creative partnership could enable. Marco talked about technologies, some of the new technologies that we need to develop or evolve or reinforce. I think some of those technologies actually are old, but we need to renew them. We need to reclaim them, perhaps. And for me, one of the big ones is our capacity to engage in co-creative relationship with the devic level, with the intelligence that is nature, with the formative energy that can allow miracles to happen. You know, the original gardens were described as miraculous. They were described as impossible. This cannot happen, but we know that it did. A small group of very dedicated, very committed people who were very willing to perceive that there is more to perceive than what their eyes could perceive. They were very willing and open to having their understanding, perception. I've gone. Oh no, there I am. Whoops. It's the stretching, you see, it's the stretching. So how you know, it's one thing to be willing to, it's one thing in our here to say, I'm willing to believe something different. I'm willing to perceive something more. It's another thing to bring it down into our other bodies. One of the things that the DEVAS seem to like to do, at least with me, part of their entertainment, I think, as they, as I try to engage with them, is to give me phrases and juxtapositions. So in several of the encounters with the devic levels, they have conversed with me about the heart's mind, which wasn't anything I had ever heard about anywhere else. I've come across it in other places now since. But it's like, what is the heart's mind? What is that? How do we, they have expressed the capacity to, that's where we have the capacity to really understand and engage. That's where we have the capacity to hold the grief or the anger that we as human beings experience when we look at some of what is happening. It's not here we can hold that, it's here. And in their company, we can hold it. They're very clear about what we're doing. They're very clear about the consequences. Sometimes they speak of the future and ask questions about which future are we headed for? Which future do we want to create? You know, the subtitle for this gathering, Shaping the Future with the Unseen Worlds. What future do we want to shape? And what are the tools with which we are going to do that? At Findhorn, a garden was shaped. A garden that first grew vegetables and then started growing people, as Peter would have said. So what do we want to grow? What's the garden of our future that we want to create? In studying with Dorothy, and in studying with, in going through a lot of David's work, my own, the width of the doorway, I guess would be the best way to put it. The width of the doorway through which I can walk into something else is expanding. But it started with this. It started with the devic. It started because I love trees and I love flowers. So I go back again and again. It's like, what do you love? What do you love? Because then there's already, half of the bridge is already built. And I notice I get very shy about sharing any of the messages. It's been a struggle for me, actually, to come to terms with making them public. And partly that's because, in some ways, they're very personal. Partly it's because the experience that I have when it's happening doesn't necessarily fully come through the words. And I would so wish that the words could carry fully the experience. But at a certain point, I was asked, it's like, well, how are people gonna know if you don't tell them? How are people gonna touch it and glimpse it and be motivated to perhaps have that relationship themselves if you don't share it, Jude? So I do, but it's still very edgy. And I don't share them from the point of view of this is the only way to engage with the devic level. It's not, by any means. It's one way in a much larger tapestry of ways to work with or collaborate. But I do want to share one particular message before I get into the slides and the visuals and let their voices speak. And this was my very first encounter with what I later came to call the voice of the forest. And it happened when I was taken to meet 1,000-year-old Araucaria. I know there's Brazilians in the audience. I hope I said that right. This massive tree, and you'll see it in one of the slideshows. And as I approached this tree, I just broke out into literally riotous laughter. I mean, I was tears streaming down my face. I ached for days afterwards because I laughed so long and hard. But as I was attuning to the Araucaria, which I later discovered is called monkey puzzle, when I discovered that, I found out that this tree that the sculpture is made out of, that's also a monkey puzzle. So and this was made by my ex-husband. So I had the connection to the tree long before I ever got to Brazil. You know, it's funny how these things work. It's funny how they work. Anyway, this is what it had to say. So I attuned after I had encountered the Araucaria. I went back in to try and, what's this other, there's something else there that I've not. So I went back in. This is what it had to say. You enter this heart of green with reverence. The deep silence awakens in your heart an ancient knowing. Herein lies an abundance of riches to bring solace to body, mind, heart, and spirit. Here, your kind is both welcomed stranger and potential danger. Your kind strips the hills, tears at the heart that purifies the waters of life. The melody of life wavers in its potency. The balances kept within Gaia are in peril, threatened by humanity's rampant desire for more. The cycles and rhythms of our kind, of all of our kind, are not constructed to keep pace with your desires. The consequences of that fact are unimaginable to you as you rest here in our embrace. The knowledge of those consequences is there to be had if you choose to see and feel them. Your heart knows what your mind cannot yet envision. For now, simply rest here. Let that which is unknowable and unspeakable fill your being. Take what costs us nothing, for its endless supply rests in the care of the One. Nourish the deepest and highest in your being, and do what it is you know is yours to do. Now, some people could hear that as, judgmental or critical or condemning or, us human beings, what are we doing? But that energy was not in any way, shape, or form present. It was just a fact. The sky is blue. A tree is green. I'm wearing black. It was a fact. And this is the feeling that constantly remains present. At times, the devas of the nature, the expressions of nature, can be quite blunt in their assessment of what we're doing. But I never get judgment. I never get anger. I never get criticism. It's just, this is what you're doing. This is part of your evolution. This is part of our evolution. We're all here to serve the same thing. We're all part of Gaia. And this is how we're working. And do we really want to keep working this way? Or maybe there's another way we can begin to work. Other times they're philosophical. Sometimes they talk about symphonies and notes. Sometimes they talk about endurance and stamina. Sometimes they talk about interdependence. I never know what they're going to want to talk about. And sometimes they don't want to talk at all. It's just a matter of being with, of hanging out in a field that is joyous and loving and empowering and deeply, deeply nourishing. So I would wish this experience. And I have no doubt that most of you have a favorite tree, or you have a favorite tree story, or somewhere in your background and in your history, maybe even in present time, there's something about relationship with tree that speaks, So what I'd like to do is read a couple of messages that had nothing to do with all this other stuff, but just engaging in conversation with a friendly presence. So I'm gonna, this first message is from a plant. It's a form of shrubbery tree called the Manica de Serra. Again, it happened in Brazil. And I have some pictures to kind of help you engage with the energy of the plant. Okay. So, the specimen that brings you to my attention is youthful in its cycle. Yet even in its youthfulness, it bears the hallmarks of my essence. The flowers that so captivate your eyes bear witness to a truth hard for modern humanity to grasp. The pure white of my flowers passes to rosy purples with time. Old flowers differ in their beauty that they present to your senses, and yet you still see beauty. Would that you applied the same seeing when you look at yourselves and at one another. The passage of time, what you would call aging, is a passage from one form of beauty to another. My flowers do not resist the transformation that comes with time. Rather, they revel in it, at least inasmuch as we of our kind can revel in such things. Each form knows its source, knows from whence it comes, and to what it shall return, when the life force of sun and soil, air and water have completed their cycles. In between beginning and ending, there is simply movement, a movement of unfolding, offering and then passing away. That same cycle is true of all life. We know this to be so and move with the unassailable truth of it. But you? What do your kind do? In how many ways do you seek to prolong youthfulness rather than learn to see the differing beauties of the movement through the cycle? In you, as in us, beauty is always present. The presence of life, of animate expression, is a gift. In the blending of our gifts, in a mutuality of respect, we contribute to the tapestry that is life, knowing ourselves to be part of a whole, too beautiful to comprehend with anything but the heart. About a year later, after that first time I went to the Atlantic rainforest, I was given the opportunity to visit again. And I spent about 2 weeks living by myself in a little house in the middle of this patch of forest. And I heard not a single human-constructed sound other than the noises I made for those 2 weeks. Occasionally, there would be an airplane way, way, way up on its way to Rio, actually. But other than that, there was only the sounds of nature. And so I was given, I walked and I read and I listened and I cried and I wrote. And I just immersed myself in the symphony that was that experience. And one of the activities that I engaged in was watching the unfolding of a tree fern frond. There were various places within some of the walks around the property where there were tree ferns, and I just became utterly fascinated. And generally my tendency is I attune to this level of reality by what catches my attention, what kind of calls me to move and to engage. So the tree fern was one of those plants. So I'd like to, if I may, continue their words rather than mine. We would speak to you of the grace of unfolding. Nature as you see it is a constant unfolding. From the seed point of idea, the patterning is unfolded. All manner of beings participate in the unfolding of pattern into form, and then the form itself unfolds. In us, that unfolding is attractive to your eye. The curled frond, likened to the head of a fine violin, unfolds quite literally. It is an unfolding you can see and follow over a course of days, an unfolding enacted an infinite number of times since we began. What you see is simply the form. You do not see the forces at work, the beings who unfold the form with fingers of light and a patience that you cannot imagine. As you admire the beauty of the form, you might also offer gratitude to the forces that shape what is so beauteous to your eyes. You too are unfolding, each and all of you, in accordance with a pattern as carefully held and nurtured as is ours. You can cooperate with that unfolding, lending your will and commitment to it, or you can resist and insist on going your own way. So many do the latter, impacting a greater, more collective unfolding. So be it. We do what we are, that is our nature. And what of your nature? Do you know what you are? What you could do? Shall you persist in manifesting only those parts of yourselves that fit the images of who you think you are? Set down the images of who you think you are. Set down the images of who others think you ought to be. Settle into the peace of the unfolding. Move with the grace of being unfolded by those fingers of patient light and discover who you really are. Okay. I said earlier that one of the kind of contradictions in terms that I've been presented with that then lead me to ponder for days or weeks on end. Another one was a reference that one of the Devas made to the moving stillness. And the message was all around the moving stillness that lies at the heart of Earth, the moving stillness that lies at the heart of the impulse to life. And how do we engage in moving stillness? I still haven't figured that out, by the way. And if any, it feels like it's an exploration of what is it to do that? What is it to hold stillness as a moving, constant presence? And how does that contribute? How could that be a resource from which we could contribute? So I said earlier that I was asked at a certain point to take out some letters. And when this first happened, my response was, my inner response was, yeah, but where am I ever going to get to share them? And very quickly, places started becoming available to share them. And I'm going to share a couple more of them here. And they are from the forest as a whole. And they are to us as a human species, but we are addressed as, the letters are addressed as dear child of Earth. And it was very clear in the moments when this communication was going on that it wanted each person to receive this letter as if it was written only to them. I think we all are aware in this room of the challenge of forest in our world, the destruction of forest, the way in which we have decimated living systems before we even know what's in them. One of the things that I have come to understand about trees is that it's not just about the physical properties that they manifest for us. It's not just about their capacity to lock carbon or to hold the land or to help establish the water table or to purify the water. That's what they do at a physical level. More important is what they do at the other subtler levels. More important is those notes that I was referring to earlier, the song that they bring in that creates part of the matrix that is Gaia. That's part of the song of the earth itself. And that song is being influenced by some of the things that we're doing. I'm sure we've all had experiences where we're feeling a little under the weather or a little off center or not quite ourselves, and somehow we find a tree and we sit under it or in it or we lean against it and we stay there a while and then we leave, and we're different when we leave. This is their gift. And they only can give that gift when they have reached a certain level of maturity. So mature trees also need to be safeguarded, not just the forests, but the mature trees in our city parks, the mature trees along our city streets. We need to ensure that they have the chance, because it's in our benefit that they are allowed to reach maturity, that they are allowed to give the gift that they give, that they are allowed to sing the note that is theirs to sing, because those notes nourish us. They help keep us healthy, they help keep us sane. So these letters from the forest are kind of a, well, we'll see what you think. So I want to invite you to close your eyes. In a moment, I'll also invite you to open them again, but for the moment. And take a moment to connect with a tree or a piece of forest or parkland that touched your heart. A forest landscape that made you take a deep breath in. Or a particular tree that was so magnificent it took your breath away. And just let yourself be in the company of that tree. That forest. And then when you're ready, you may want to keep your eyes closed and stay with that tree. Or you may want to open them and stay with some images of the forest that delivered this letter, that it wrote to you. Dear child of earth, we call to you from this heart of green, from tree-clad slopes and mountaintops, from watercourses that cut the hills, generating songs that carry as far as those of the feathered ones, from deepest earth, rich, red, and verdant. We call to you that in us you may know yourself. We call to the nature in you. We call to awaken remembrance within you. Remembrance of a knowledge of oneness. We call out our welcome. Will you hear? Will you walk silently amongst us, listening to the sounds of the forest, setting aside for a while the sounds of your cities? Will you come with your eyes open and see the beauty? Will you come with your heart open and allow it to break open fully with wonder? Will you come with a mind empty of what you want and discover what you need? Will you come and claim your place amongst us? Will you come that you may know yourself, that we may know each other? Come. Again and again the invitation is extended. Such is our nature, to welcome all life. Come. Walk. Watch. Sit. Listen. Feel. Come. Know us and know yourself. Dear child of earth, and still we call to you from moss-covered rocks above sparkling pools, from tendrils of lichen hanging from high branches, through the croaks of the frogs, and the high shrill of the hawk. Through all of these and more, we call to you. In the whirring of the hummingbird's wings, hear our call. In the soft flutter of the morpho butterfly as it slips through the air, hear our call. In the vistas from the tops of waterfalls, feel our call. As cold water streams wash your feet, feel our call. In the delicacy of the ferns, hear our call. In the brilliant flashes of the green of the parakeets, see our call. In the hues and shapes of the orchids, hear our call. In the majesty of the jaguar, hear our call. In the howl of the monkey, hear our call. In the fragrance of the flowers, hear our call. With innumerable voices, we call. We appeal to your senses, invading each of them, seemingly to little avail. We call you again and again. Will you come? Will you walk and sit and dream amongst us? Will you close your eyes and see the truth of our oneness, and then open them again and see the beauty? Can you look and see the bounty without calculating the productivity? Come, in celebration of life, yours, ours, come and let us know one another. Your kind, with all its capacities, could give so much to aid a new balance in Gaia. Instead, your kind generally continues to take. You behave as if you do not know that at least at the physical level, form is finite. Here where we meet lie infinite resources, resources to fuel a new balance, a new order for all life. The possibility of making that potential real lies in your heart's mind. Surrendering to that would mean altering your perception of yourselves and of us. You are intrigued? So then, what now? And one final one. From here too the call is sent forth. The invitation constantly extended, though few hear it in its fullness. You come to escape your cities, to breathe air less tainted by the ways you choose to live, to see and to hear water that sets its own path and pace as it follows the call home to the sea. Here you catch glimpses of the diversity of life that is our nature. And in your ignorance, you tell yourselves you have touched the wild. You bring your children that they may know nature, and then take them back to lives denuded of it. Small wonder they lose their connecting with what was once so natural. You bring with you devices that introduce frequencies unnatural to our environs. You stare at your devices, so thoroughly enthralled to information and connection that you cannot behold the wonders immediately before you. You look, yet do not see. You listen, yet do not hear. You touch, yet do not feel. You talk, yet not with us. You come and spend your time in our presence to build relationships with lovers, friends, family, yet build no relationship with us. Come, for a few hours or a few days. Turn off the devices. Take pictures only with your heart. Feast with your eyes and your ears, and then go home, replete. The last letter came while I was in Thailand. I was in a national park in the northeast of Thailand. Hence the thing about, taking devices and spending all your time on them and not necessarily engaging with what was around. Now, I read that particular piece in a talk that I gave in Bangkok. And it had quite an effect on people, actually, for which I was very, I was glad that I'd risked sharing it, and so people could hear. So I want to finish with just a question, I guess, really. Thank you for listening. A number of years ago, I was attending a conference in the Netherlands, and one of the speakers introduced this idea of instead of going if only, we do a lot of regretting and looking backwards and going if only, if only, if only. And he had this habit of trying to turn the if only around to a what if. What if? So I have a what if that I've been asking of myself and of some of the people that I encounter ever since I first started reading Dorothy's messages, ever since I first started really understanding the nature and the profound experiment that these early gardens represented, that the early community represented here. That there was an experiment in co-creation with multiple dimensions, and it created a result. So my question goes something like this. What if? What if what happened in that small group of people all those years ago, what if that happened across the world? What if more people with those connections and that level of commitment engaged consciously and deliberately? What if? What solutions might we find for some of the challenges that lie before us? What kind of creative ways forward might we find? The world may well be a very different place very soon. I don't think it's about trying to recreate the planet we've had till now, but it's how do we engage and create a new life, a new civilization, a new world that works. And for me, that question and that possibility gives me hope. Thank you.